Hello, and welcome to the LeadingAge Washington Conference. This is Understanding the New Generations. In this session, we are going to be talking about all of the generations currently in the workplace, but more specifically, we will talk about Millennials and Generation Z. We will talk about the 4 challenges those generations face and how we can help them in the workplace. My name is Robert Moore. I am the Director of Training for Time Equipment Company. And over the last 20 years, I've worked in a variety of industries, but always in a training or HR role. I also currently sit on the National Marketing Committee for the Boy Scouts of America. And this gives me a ton of access to information on millennial moms, their children, and the next generation coming down the line, the Alpha generation. I've been married nearly 25 years, and I have 2 children, one that's 24 and one that's 20. And while there's less than a 3-year age difference between these two, they are in 2 entirely different generations. So let's talk about them. My daughter, right out of high school, was accepted into an animation program. And after a year of prerequisites, she had to take a class on a particular animation software. Unfortunately, there were not enough students to fill the class, so it was canceled. And also, unfortunately, it's only offered once a year. So she got out of cycle. She was going to have to wait a year to take this class. Well, she didn't want to wait a year. So she entered the workforce and has actually been doing very well, full-time job, and also now has a side business making cupcakes because now she wants to go to culinary school. My son saw what my daughter did and also saw that she accumulated $9,000 in debt just in the first year. And he said, I want nothing to do with that. So he entered the workforce right away. Started off with a couple of contract jobs, but then got hired full-time as a warehouse lead at a company. Unfortunately, COVID hit, and somebody with the disease came into his warehouse and they closed it down. They furloughed all the entire staff, and once they were ready to come back from the furlough, there wasn't enough work for them to do, so they laid them all off. So he's looking for his next opportunity. As you can see, the 2 pictures on the screen are not of my children, but of New York City, one of the Twin Towers and one of the Liberty Tower. Well, that's because 9/11 was the defining event that characterized these 2 generations. My daughter was sitting right next to me when the plane hit the 2nd tower. My son was less than a year old and has no recollection of the event. And that's how sociologists really look at how they define the different generations, is those major events that happen around them. In addition, it's like a pendulum. The activities of one generation tend to swing back and forth. The first generation we're going to talk about is the silent generation. Now, the silent generation lived through World War II and the Korean War. Now, understand, they grew up in a world of scarcity. Their parents lived through the Great Depression, and they had that same mentality put on them. As a matter of fact, during World War II, they had to do specific metal drives and rubber drives just to fund the war effort, buy bonds. Now also understand, 1 in 4 men between the ages of 18 and 23 served in the military. So when they came back, they were used to that type of environment when it came to the business world. They were used to the pyramid structure, the chain of command, not questioning anybody above you. That was normal in the way they worked at things. And because of that, their work ethic was extremely strong. They were pro-company. They expected to be able to work at that company for the rest of their life. Also remember, the women that were working in the factories during World War II are now coming home and are the primary caregivers of their children. This brings us to the next generation, and that's the baby boomers. Now, that previous generation, when they came back, they had a lot of kids. As you can see, over 76 million of them. Their defining event was the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now, there is a cusp generation in there of those that don't remember that, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, understand, this is a time when they used to trust the government and used to trust their employer, and now are starting to have second thoughts. That pendulum is swinging. This is the time of Vietnam, the time of Watergate. And because of that, they tended to rebel against the man. They desired independence. They wanted to be their own person. And while they grew up with the structure that their parents had put in place with this militaristic style structure, they were now questioning that structure. Now, currently, this generation holds more wealth than any other generation in history. And remember, they're also one generation of hope because they're the ones that watched a human land on the moon. The next generation is Generation X. That's my generation. And their defining event was the Space Shuttle Challenger. I remember specifically, I was a senior in high school, and early in the morning went to our gym where they'd put up a sheet to project on so we can watch the Challenger launch because Sally Ride, the teacher, was on that particular shuttle. And we watched as less than 2 minutes after liftoff, the Challenger exploded. Now that affected me a lot personally because I had planned on being an astronaut. And now those things were in question. Now also remember, this generation is the generation of Reagan. Throughout my entire middle school, high school era, Reagan was the only president I knew. This is also the generation of cable television. This is where CNN comes into play, MTV comes into play, back when they had videos, okay? This is also a very selfish generation. Now remember, because they're latchkey kids, they were told when they got home from school, they would pick up the phone, they would call their parents and say, I'm home. And their whole job was to not burn the house down. So in that, they're very self-centered. And because of that, it's that generation of greed. Remember Wall Street, greed is good. Well, this is also the advent of the credit card, where if you can't get it, well, just charge it. Now, this generation also was told that if you wanted to get ahead, you had to go to college. You didn't have to, but if you wanted to get that leap, you had to go to college. There were plenty of trade jobs for them to go to, but if you wanted to take that leap, you had to go to college. And so they were saddled with a bunch of student loan debt. Now, the next generation are the millennials. And we'll see that pendulum swing. Because remember the cable television generation just before? Well, they were at home watching this 24-hour news cycle. Before, if they wanted to get any information, they had to watch a network news show or get their information from the newspaper. But now, all that information is now coming to them live to their living room without parents there. Remember, they're latchkey kids. Well, they now see not just the occasional child abduction, but now they're seeing it on a regular basis. And the sexual assaults and the burnings in certain towns and in the death and destruction everywhere. And that's now flooded into their brains. And because of that, they now turn into the helicopter parent. Now, also remember, this generation's defined by 9/11. Now, also look how many of them there are. 80 million millennials are out there. They grew up in an environment in school of more of a team structure. The previous generation, it was all about grades, okay? In this one, they want things more from a team dynamic brought in from Japan and their philosophies. When it comes to college, this generation was told not just to get ahead you had to go to college, but it was now a prerequisite to getting into any job. You had to go to college. And so this generation is saddled with a ton of student loan debt. As a matter of fact, the national student loan debt now sits at $1.6 trillion. And finally, this generation has taken more pictures than any other generation in history. As a matter of fact, in 2015, there were more pictures taken in that year than in all recorded history combined. The pendulum now swings to the next generation, which is Generation Z. And their defining event is going to be COVID. There are 76 million in this generation. And by next year, 2021, this generation will comprise of at least 20% of the workforce. Now, they're starting to look a lot like baby boomers in the fact that they want to work for a stable company. Now, remember in 2008, this generation saw their parents lose their home and lose their job. So they want stability. But there's a caveat to that. We'll get to that in a moment. The iPhone came out in 2007. So my son has never remembered a world without the iPhone. And because of that, everything is on demand. This generation has taken more video than pictures. Unlike the previous generation, selfie, 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 this generation is using YouTube and Snapchat and TikTok to watch videos, to learn things, and to communicate with people. And like I talked about before, this generation believes that debt is bad. They would much rather buy the used car versus the new car. They would rather their employer pay for them to go to college than them pay for it themselves. And finally, this generation grew up in an age where they did not have a safety zone of information. So previous generations, it was filtered by the access of that information. This generation is getting the notification. There's the bling, that notification letting them know there's something new to look at. And because of that, all that information is unfiltered. They're getting it from everywhere. And this leads us to the final generation that we're going to talk about, and that's the Alpha generation. And while there's not a lot of research on this generation, there are some things that kind of differentiate those. So if they can remember the effects of COVID, so for example, they're 7 years old and they remember not being able to go to school because of COVID, well, they're probably part of Generation Z. If they have no recollection of that, they're going to fall into this generation, or the Alpha generation. Now, currently, there's about 9,000 kids born every day into this generation. Now, that number is expected to go up because of COVID. Well, it's going to happen around that November, December, January, February timeframe as people were structured to go to their homes, and, well, naturally things happen. This generation is going to be totally immersed in technology. They won't understand a world without having some piece of technology in their hand. One, they see their parents do that, and they want to emulate their parents. They're also going to be taught in a method that's completely different than what previous generations have had. They're going to have augmented reality. They're going to have teaching that is specific for that student and not for the classroom as a whole. It's expected that 20% of this generation is going to live in a single parent home, not because of a reality like divorce, but more because of choice. This also has the potential to be the most conflicted generation ever. I was reading an article a couple of days ago regarding a student who was on Zoom for their elementary class. And this is a second grader. And the teacher was teaching them one thing. And because the parents also in the home, they can overhear what the teacher is teaching them. And then the parent came up behind the student and said, no, that's not true. Well, now you've got a second grader trying to have to decide between their teacher and their parent. And that can provide a lot of challenges. Now, they're also predicted to be the wealthiest generation as the baby boomers start to pass on their wealth down the generations. They're going to push it down as far as possible. They're not going to give it to their kids, or maybe not even to their grandkids, but to their great-grandkids. To show you an example of this generation, I want you to see this short video.
No, I will keep behind it. No! My name is Saul, and I'm like 7.5. I have like this math thing. It's called Zern. I do it on sometimes my phone and my PC. Most of the screen time I have is on my PC. I don't really like to watch movies, but I like to watch a lot of TV shows. I'm going into like older ones, like ones about science. I watch 3 or 4 different shows on Netflix.
I have been playing video games since I was 3. I do enjoy playing video games, but it's more of an addiction.
I saw them on YouTube. I like to buy stuff I see on YouTube.
Sometimes advertisements on YouTube pop up. I don't think I've seen anything on the advertisements that was really worth getting.
What would you want to do for a job?
Play the adult games on Daddy's phone. I'm gonna be an airplane driver. A scientist.
When I grow up, I want to be a graphic novelist because I draw a lot. I prefer to draw normally on paper, but I prefer to make animations on a computer. I don't use my parents' phone because I kind of have my own. That's just for like games and stuff.
I would rather have an iPad better than a dog.
What pets do you have? Do you have a dog? Wilfred? So you try to have a conversation with them when they're on technology and it's just can't.
I found that video interesting, so I thought I'd share. So what is the difference between millennials and Generation Z? Because they're often lumped together, but there are distinct differences between these generations. Let's take a look. Millennials, when it comes to their employer, 62% trust their employer, as compared to just 42% of Gen Z. Now, we talked about this. Understand Gen Z have seen their parents lose their job, lose their house back in 2008, so they realize that their employer is just a source of income, or at least that's the way they view it. Willing to ghost their employer. 26% felt it was okay just to quit their employer and not tell them, for millennials. For Gen Z, it's nearly half, because again, they realize that it's just a source of income. Social media, or what should just be called media. For millennials, they use Facebook most of the time. Gen Z will use anything but Facebook. My son tells me, well, I don't use Facebook because you're on it. And let's be honest, this should not be called social media. It should be called just media. Because for Generation Z, this is how they get their information. They don't watch the nightly news. They don't read newspapers. They're getting their information, their news, from some sort of social media source. We've talked about debt. The average debt for a millennial for student loans is $38,390. And then you tack on credit card debt, and they are starting in a hole to start their life. Generation Z wants nothing to do with debt. Absolutely nothing to do with it. Again, for several factors. They see what happened with their older siblings, and they see their parents have lost their house. So they don't want to be saddled with debt. Conversation. The thumb power, as millennials would say, text, 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 text. Generation Z, they prefer a face-to-face conversation. Now understand, they don't have to be in the same room. They grew up with the iPhone. They are used to having FaceTime available to them. They're used to having Snapchat so that they can look at somebody when they talk to them. That's what they've grown up with. Here's some more statistics. Millennials, when it comes to employment, 55% of them work for more than one employer. They have a second job. Gen Z, they have a side gig. So they're doing the Uber, the Lyft, the Grubhub, the DoorDash. They're the ones that have this side hustle where they get to create their own hours and work at their own schedule. For millennials, 62% of them have direct reports, which that's understandable with that particular group right now. They should be in that role, in that at least middle management role. But look at Gen Z, 49% have direct reports. Think of the stress level that's putting on that age group that right now in the workforce is between 18 and 23. I found this interesting, so I thought I'd include it. School lockdowns. Millennials, 54% of the time had experienced a threat in school. For Gen Z, 82% of all Gen Zs have experienced a time when they locked down the school for a safety reason. Do you think security is important when it comes to the workplace? Definitely. Millennials, and this is not uncommon with all generations that are in this particular age group. As they grow up, they need more security. They need the stable job. Generation Z, again, like all generations, want that flexibility. But they actually are demanding that flexibility. Whether that's flexibility in their schedule or flexibility in how they work, whether it's from home or at the office, that's what they're looking for. And finally, brand. This is quite interesting. Millennials use brand as a status symbol. I mean, how many ladies out there have a Coach purse or Michael Kors purse or special shoes? Generation Z view brand as a personal expression of their identity or to a cause. For example, my son likes Under Armour, but it's why he likes Under Armour. You see, when Steph Curry, who is an Under Armour endorser, was trying to get his first shoe deal, he wanted to put a biblical verse on his shoes. And he spoke to Nike first, and Nike said no. Then when he talked to Under Armour said, sure, we can do that. And it's because of that type of transaction that my son prefers Under Armour. And the fact that he likes Steph Curry and the Golden State Warriors. To show an example of this, I want you to watch this short video.
This is the story of the greatest sock never sold. It's not for sale in any stores, and you can't buy it online. But somehow, we just shipped our 10 millionth pair. You may be wondering, who makes a sock that no one can buy? I'm Randy.
And I'm Dave.
And we're Bombas. Socks are the #1 most requested clothing item at homeless shelters. So for every pair of super comfortable Bombas socks you buy, we donate this pair to someone in need. They're specifically designed to meet the needs of the homeless community with reinforced seams and antimicrobial treatment in darker colors to show less visible wear. And thanks to your purchases and support, we just donated our 10 millionth pair to shelters around the country. It's these 10 million small acts of human kindness that make this the greatest sock never sold. Give a pair when you buy a pair at bombas.com.
Now, the point of that video was not to advertise Bombos, but to show you how the correlation between a company and a cause is important to Generation Z. As a matter of fact, this generation is willing to spend 28% more on an item that supports a cause that's important to them. So I ask you, is your brand important to them? How do you recognize your brand when it comes to these type of issues. Food for thought. Next up, it's presidential trivia time. Yes, it's time for us to take a little break from all the information we're gathering and just take a guess on some things. So we're going to look at the presidents and try to identify which generation they belong to and how that relates to, presidential campaigns. So the first one up is, which one was born first, John F. Kennedy or Ronald Reagan? I'll give you a time to think. Yes, Ronald Reagan is almost 6 years older than John F. Kennedy. And they're both part of the greatest generation, and that's those that are currently in assisted living centers right now. Let's look at the next one. Who was born first, Donald Trump or Bill Clinton? The answer is Donald Trump, just barely. And it's interesting when we'll see the timeline how this truly plays out. They're both part of the baby boomer generation. So you have to think, okay, well, nowadays, who would be the closest to the vast majority of generations now? Most would say Barack Obama. But when was he born? Quickly get out your phones, try and find out the birth date. He was actually born in 1961. He's the generation of hope because he's the one that saw that first human land on the moon. He was almost 8 years old at the time. But still part of the baby boomer generation. When you look at the timeline of presidents, you'll see something very interesting. A vast majority of them are part of the greatest generation. Some in the silent, and then you'll notice that there are 3 presidents that are actually born within a 6-week period, just 1 year after the end of World War II. So where does Joe Biden, the current Democratic presidential candidate, fit? Well, he was born in 1942. So he's also part of the silent generation. How's that play out when it comes to politics? It's interesting when you look at a voting block of millennials of 80 million and a potential voting block of Gen Z at 76 million as they start to get older, as they start to get to that voting age. What's going to happen when that group starts to make decisions politically? So why is this important? How does this affect anything? Well, Simon Sinek, author of Start With Why and The Infinite Game, and the 3rd most watched TED Talk in history, sat down in an interview with Inside Quest that talked about millennials in the workplace. And when you look back at other things that he's spoken, he's really talking about both millennials and Gen Z. And there are 4 challenges for the new generations in the workplace. And those 4 challenges are, number 1, parenting, how they were raised. Technology, and that's the availability and the use of technology that that generation has. Impatience or instant gratification, being able to get anything at a moment's notice, and the environment or the culture and where they work. So let's look at the first one, parenting. Now, remember the helicopter parents? Well, they told their kids that they're special, that they can have anything they want. If need be, I can get you into that special class or that special after-school activity or that special sports club. And we don't want anybody to fail, so everybody's going to get that participation trophy. I'm not saying that any of that is bad. What I'm saying is that there's a result that happens because of those type of teachings. You take that group of children, they grow up, you introduce them to the workplace, and now they're not special. They can't have anything they want. Parents cannot get them that job or that promotion. And there are no participation trophies, especially if they're talking to somebody that's in a baby boomer or Gen X situation. They're saying that their paycheck is their participation trophy. So You put that all together and their self-esteem is shattered. Technology. We all have to admit that technology has been both good and challenging for a lot of people, and especially this generation. They use technology to its full extent, don't get me wrong. But now technology is starting to interrupt their day. Okay? Understand that social media is an addiction. When they get that like or that notification or that text, it gives that chemical reaction in their brain, releasing dopamine. And it's the same chemical that's used with cigarette smoking and gambling, sex, alcohol. It's all the same chemical release in the brain. And while it may be okay to have some of these, okay, any of these in excess is not a good thing. In a survey of millennials, 67% said it was fine for a child to have their own smartphone at 13 years old. It's interesting when you look at some of the statistics, especially when it comes to middle school aged girls and high school aged girls. The suicide rate for those groups are up over 100% than they were just 4 years ago. Do you think there's a correlation? Well, that's for you to decide. The next one is that impatience, okay? The new generation rarely waits for anything, okay? If they want something, they expect to get it overnight. You look at Amazon, Netflix, they can watch a movie, binge watch a whole series in one day. They are not waiting from week to week to get to know what happened from the cliffhanger from the previous week. No, we're going to watch the whole thing all at once. You know, Tinder, swipe left, swipe right, internet access. They have no concept of dial-up, you know, that my generation grew up, and a job application. For both my son and my daughter, if they can't apply on their phone, they don't apply. Why? They don't have a laptop or a computer. All they have is their phone. So if there's not a way for them to connect even their LinkedIn account and be able to automatically put that information into an application, they flat don't apply. And that leads to that delayed gratification. They don't understand what that is. You know, they've been told their whole life that Social Security is not going to be there, and they don't want to have to save for a car or college. So they will take on the debt if it's something they really want. Gen Z, less likely than millennials, but they will take that on. They're looking for that jump ahead. And unfortunately, this also pertains to development of social relationships or work relationships. They expect to be able to get that feedback immediately. They do not want to wait for the annual evaluation or even a quarterly evaluation. They're looking for that coaching and mentoring right now to know if they're doing good. And the environment that they're working in. New generations believe most corporations look at the short-term gains instead of the long-term growth of their employees. As we've seen, it's just a lack of trust. Okay? They believe they're not in an environment to develop their career, overcome these technology addictions, or take a risk. Why is that? That's because of the school systems that they've been trained to be in. Okay? They've been in that A, B, C, D grade mentality, and they've been taught, go to school, get good grades to get the good job. Well, that means that they can't fail. There's no opportunity for them to fail at school. They can't just try something out and see if they like it. They have to take the class they know they will be successful in, or even take a lower level class in order to get the good grade. When you take that mentality into the workforce, Well, now you have a company that's not willing to take a risk. And we all know that taking that risk is necessary in some instances. Now, understand when it comes to things like compliance and guidelines, you're not taking any risks when it comes to there. But as far as growing your company, you have to take risks. But unfortunately, our school system is not training a workforce to do that. So what can we do? How can we help this group in the workplace? Well, the first thing we can do is take responsibility. Back in the 1900s, when families were working the family farm, their children saw exactly what their parents did on a daily basis. They knew they had to feed the cows and feed the chickens every day. They had to milk the cows every day. They had to maintain the fences and make sure all the animals were watered. They had to plow the fields. They had to plant it. They knew that delayed gratification of planting a seed and harvesting that when it was time. They saw all of that because they saw their parents do that. I asked the question, if you have kids, do your kids know what you do for work? What you do on a daily basis? Now you're seeing a little bit more of it now because people are starting to work from home. But do they really know what you do? In most instances, they come home from school. Hours later, the parent comes home. They may make dinner, or the more likely scenario is they brought home dinner. They eat dinner, and then the parent sits in their chair and watches television. They don't know what the parents do for work. They don't know the work ethic that's involved. And it's interesting because there's an opportunity for them to teach, especially Gen Z right now, because Gen Z, again, doesn't like debt, wants that financial literacy. They want to know about 401ks and how to save up. They may not be able to do it because of the amount of money that they're making, but they want to know that the opportunity is at least there. And they may try to do something. And the reason is because they saw their parents lose their house, lose their job, and they want that type of security. They want financial security, not job security. And part of that comes down to setting clear expectations. We must set clear expectations with our workforce. Generation Z and millennials want to know the why. How does this affect the company as a whole? How does what I do affect everyone else? They want to know because that gives them the sense of purpose. If you're just showing them this task, do this checklist, they don't see how that contributes to the overall growth and happiness and experience in a company. Next is that technology piece. Now this is where companies can actually learn from Gen Z and millennials. Now, first and foremost, you have to set the expectations on cell phone use. So whether you're a company that absolutely does not want them to have cell phones, or the other end of the spectrum of them allowing cell phone use, it's a matter of setting the expectation. As long as you set the expectation and enforce that expectation, that's what's important for this generation. Because as soon as they go on break or on their lunch, they're heading straight for their phone. As a matter of fact, they're more likely to go to their phone than they are to eat. Because let's face it, we just talked about it, it is an addiction. Okay? Understand technology is just the entry point to attract this workforce. We talked about in order to apply for a job, they need to be able to do it on their cell phone. Interesting, my son, in what he wants to do next, he wants to be a firefighter and an EMT. And he goes to enroll in the classes. And one of the requirements is that he reads the first 4 chapters of the textbook and pass those first 4 chapters with a score of 80 or higher. Now, somebody that's a baby boomer or Gen X thinks nothing of that. Saying, well, that's how you learn. Well, understand, he doesn't have a textbook. They give him those in a PDF file. And also understand, he does not have a laptop. All he has is a cell phone. So trying to read that and comprehend that is nearly impossible. And the first thing out of his mouth was, why don't they have a video on this? One of the items in those first 4 chapters was how to pick up a patient and carry them. And his response was, a video would be so much easier to explain this. Why don't they have this on video? So this is where technology can be used in training your employees. How do you train your employees? Is it just a checklist or read this manual? Or are you actually demonstrating or have videos of how to do things properly? Because that's how you're going to attract this next generation. A couple other things you can do is discouraging the use of cell phones during meetings, but you also have to give employees the time to think, and oftentimes that's with training, or giving them that rest period that they need just to decompress without technology. And finally is consistency. This generation has grown up in a school structure where everything is laid out for them. And they need the same type of structure when it comes to the workforce. They need those expectations. Consistency creates credibility. Credibility creates trust, and people buy based on trust. Trust is what fosters loyalty. When you're talking about that nearly half of Generation Z willing to ghost their employer, 9 times out of 10, it's because they don't trust them. It's not because of the bad work conditions or the schedule. It's they just flat don't trust their employer to be in their best interest anymore. Thank you for attending this presentation. If you'd like some more information, there's a couple of resources that will help augment this information. One is a book called Z-Economy by Jason Dorsey. That talks about the economics of the next generation coming forward. The second is a movie on Netflix called Social Influence, and it's talking about the addiction of cell phone use, and more specifically about Facebook. If you'd like a copy of this presentation, there's a QR code here on the screen. Just scan it with your phone and you'll be able to download this entire presentation. If you'd like me to do this presentation for your organization, either virtually through Zoom or in a live presentation once all of the COVID regulations are taken away, feel free to contact me at any of the locations here on the screen. Thank you very much, and thank you for attending Understanding the New Generations.